off by congratulating Maha and Mamdouh once again. I've been to a number of meetings with Mamdouh since he was released from Guantanamo Bay in 2005 and got back to Australia, and I think this has to be one of the sweetest ones because as we've, because this is after his compensation payout without an apology. We're still waiting for the apology, and with the government being forced to give back Mamdouh's passport, which I know from the previous times that I've met and spoken to, it's been one of the things that's been very dear to their hearts to try and get some kind of redress on these things and to have their lives restored to them. And also, I think it's worth just drawing out that, in the other times that I've met both Maha and Mamdouh, about the routine harassment, that the break-ins where no valuables are stolen but their papers are rifled through, the constant harassment on the street by probably ASIO agents and just racists and things like that, the police harassment that that Mamdouh's just detailed. All of this, I think now we can say they've had a victory over with the recent government's decision to give them compensation and to give Mamdouh back his passport. And I think that's
by force.
Yes, yes, but still a victory for you. And I think that's a really important thing that we want to celebrate, because I think that the Habibs getting their lives back, and not just Mamdouh, their entire family, I think is a really important thing that we've been fighting for and trying to support the Habibs on. But also, I think highlights what you can do if you don't give in, you don't stand up. And I think that's one of the most inspiring things that Mamdouh brings to meetings like this, is his sense of determination and resistance. And determination, let's be clear, in some of the worst circumstances on earth. Like, I don't think anyone would say that there's not anything worse on earth than Guantanamo Bay. It was meant to be the worst thing on earth for people, and he's come through shining and saying that he wants to keep fighting. And I think that's an inspiration to us all. But it does raise the question, is Mamdouh's experience unique? Is it just Mamdouh's experience just, that he came into the hands of a few nasty officials or anything like it? Or is it systematic? I think probably some of you will start to work out the answer to this, but I think it's worth drawing it out in a little bit more detail. Because let's be clear, the Guantanamo Bay, all of the details have come out. Now, all of the sordid details, the horrible treatment that Mamdouh was, meted out with, all of that has come out now. Yet at the time, I went back and looked at some of the press reports today. Actually, there's an entire government library of all the press reports on the web that you can look at, where Ruddock said, is saying in 2003, we don't know where he is. We don't know what we know he's been treated fairly inhumanely while he's been rendered in Egypt and being tortured with Australian officials present throughout this torture. And they lied through their teeth, but they knew it was going on. So that is that. But really, is this treatment that was meted out to Mamdouh, is it so different to what has happened to those families that have been blown up by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan? People have probably seen that report that came out at the end, towards the end of last year, of an incident where Australian soldiers were involved in taking out the entire family, including 6 civilians, 5 of whom were children. So what? And then they said, oh, it was self-defense. And I don't know what kind of 4-year-old is that going to be that great at aiming an automatic weapon at fully grown and armed to the teeth soldiers. But, and then there was a hue and cry that came afterwards about how dare these soldiers be charged with any kind of war crime for killing this family. Actually, they were acting in self-defense, and it was completely legitimate, and those charges have subsequently been dropped. So you both see there the brutal treatment that the Australian state is capable of meting out, and the blatant hypocrisy that, in terms of the way the media reports it and the way in which the state dealt it when you compare to the experiences that Mamdouh has had to go through. Is it so different, the treatment that Mamdouh has experienced, to the treatment that the Australian state and the government metes out to refugees, where people are forced to make perilous journeys and then put in the most disgusting of circumstances? And I think the comparison that the refugee activists in the refugee campaign have made to Christmas Isle and comparing it to Guantanamo Bay is completely fair. And when you see the inspiring resistance of the refugees and the kind of desperation that is on their faces when they try and break out of those circumstances, I think they feel it too. And finally, is the treatment that Mamdouh's experienced so very different to the treatment that's meted out to Aboriginal people, when we see the kinds of squalid conditions that they're forced to live in and the disgusting racism that is directed towards them whenever they complain or say, actually, we need some more money, we need actually more dialysis machines, more infrastructure and services to actually cure the Aboriginal people who have an extraordinary rate of kidney disease, which has been one of the stories that's been floating around this week about the horrific treatment towards Aboriginal people. But it does raise the question, why do these atrocities keep happening? Why is the Australian government and the Australian state such a purveyor of horrible violence? And why do we see so much hypocrisy when the violence that's carried out by the state is sanctioned and seen to be something that should be congratulated or celebrated in many instances, and yet the violence that was done to Mamdouh and his family is seen to be, you know, if you raise your fist and say something, you know, that you don't like this, that somehow you get branded with the horrible word of terrorist. But I think that we have to look at the way in which the system works and the needs and interests that that state serves. So Australia is a capitalist economy, just like the ones around the rest of the world, just like the ones that are crisis-ridden throughout Western Europe and the Middle East, just like the ones that are imposing the horrible austerity measures, and then we've seen some of the inspiring and revolutionary resistance over there. I'll talk more about that later. Of course, Australia has weathered the economic storm a lot better than most economies, and things are a lot more stable here, but I think we can see the kind of callous treatment that is meted out to people by the Australian state, and I think we can expect the same kind of brutal austerity when the Australian economy is affected by the financial crisis. But the Australian state basically serves the interests of the rich and powerful in our society. All of those people who own and control all of the wealth. The Gina Rineharts of the world, who I think is now Australia's richest person. She's not just the richest woman, she's now the richest person. That's nice and equality, you know, makes it to the top echelons of our society. But the Australian state, you know, makes the rules, makes the laws, creates the police forces and the armies, the institutions that police and perpetuate that system of wealth, so that it's all right for someone like Gina Rinehart, whose own personal wealth could cure world poverty if she chose. But no, that Australian state backs up and says that this wealth, this disgusting inequality is not only good, it should be protected and upheld, and anyone who tries to challenge it should be trampled upon. And it's this tiny elite that the Australian state serves. It's those who can own and control all the wealth in our society. So, for example, there's an interesting statistic on our website today that for every mining worker who makes $100,000 in wages, they actually make $600,000 worth of wealth for the mining bosses. So this is the kind of daily robbery that we're seeing from the workers who go down and toil in horrible conditions in the mines, making upwards of close to $1 million for every year of their toil for their bosses. And it's the Australian state that protects and defends these interests both overseas and at home. And it's because of the competitive nature of that system that all of the mining bosses, the Gina Rineharts of the world, are competing with every other mining boss in the world, that they need and rely upon the Australian state to promote their interests, to protect their trade routes, and to engage in wars to try and give themselves a bit of an edge on their rivals all around the world. So in the case of the US-Australia alliance, the Australian state gets lauded around the South Pacific, as we've seen with their interventions into places like East Timor, the Solomons and Papua New Guinea, and they support the US's expansion of its empire, particularly in places like the Middle East with the brutal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and supporting the State of Israel in their ongoing attempts to crush the Palestinians and police the Middle East in general. So of course the state is not a benevolent institution, and they very much take the opposite side in the class war, both promoting imperialist ambition abroad, but also I think in the domestic front, which means policing us and trying to foment divisions amongst us all. So I think one of the clearest examples of the domestic agenda of the war on terror, and one that I think really serves the interests of the rich and powerful in our society, is stoking racism. And I think that Mamdouh has been such an unfortunate scapegoat in that attempt to stoke racism, to paint all Arabs and Muslims as terrorists, to try and demonise his resistance and his outrage at his terrible treatment by sort of implying that he's just an Arab or a Muslim and they're all secretly terrorists. And you think, and people have just even implied that some of the worst, more right-wing columnists have openly said this, and they've been campaigning against Mamdouh and his family in the press, as Mamdouh's talked about. And I think that the imprisonment of Mamdouh Habib, the harassment of his family, and not just Mamdouh Habib, but the trials of Arab and Muslim men for thought crime, the ongoing demonisation of women who wear the burqa in our society, and any kind of expression of Muslim faith. All of that is about stoking racism and softening people up to accept the kinds of casualties that the Australian Army has perpetuated in places like Afghanistan, to make it seem all right that you can kill an entire family and wipe out all their children, so that no one will ever remember the family, let alone mourn their deaths, is an acceptable thing to do in Afghanistan. This is the role the Australian state plays in stoking this kind of racism, and we've seen the way in which they've also stoked this racism towards the refugees. And so we've also seen with the war on terror, not just the increase of surveillance and state oppression against Muslims and Arabs, it's been very useful in also extending the state into policing, I think, that key social force in our society, the working class. The one social force in our society that has the ability to stand up and challenge the system of profits by withholding their labour and shutting that system down. So it's not surprising then that one of the key things that we've seen emerge in the last 10 years in terms of trying to discipline rowdy or militant unions has been the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which has war on terror and ASIO-like powers to be able to, call people in for questioning. To if you refuse to answer their questions, you can go to jail for 6 months. No. If only some of the construction unions had the tenacity of Mamdouh, they probably would be paying all the horrendous fines that have been levelled against them by the Australian Building and Construction Commission, but that's another topic for another discussion another day. But the point is that, where we let them, where the state is, where people acquiesce and accept, the inroads against one group of people, it makes it so much easier for the state to then go and use their extended powers to police other groups. And I think the Australian Building and Construction Commission is the bastard child of the war on terror. And I think that's why showing such important solidarity and resistance and having people like Mamdouh around is so important, because you push them back on that front, it makes it so much harder for them to try and then use their power, use the state's powers to crack down on militant unions like the construction, forestry and mining unions. But I think that my main point is that Mamdouh's experience is just one little experience that I think the Australian government and Australian capitalism is capable of meting out. It's a vicious, horrible system, one that puts profits ahead of ordinary people's lives and needs, and if it continues to exist, we'll continue to see Mamdouh Habibs and their horrific experiences and some of the other things that I've talked about. And I want to finish on a positive note though, because it's not all doom and gloom. I think if we come to this realisation that the capitalist system is completely and utterly flawed, that it's a horrible, vicious, callous, brutal system, well then we have to think about the kind of resistance. And I think Mamdouh pointed to the revolution on our banner, and I think that is the hope of the world. If you want to see breaking down of state oppression, you only have to look at the heroic battles that happened in Tahrir Square, where thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people faced some of the most brutal secret police apparatus in the entire world, and they won. They didn't just have some standoff, they completely and utterly crushed the attempt to wind up their revolution. And we've seen with the subsequent battles of invading the secret police headquarters in Cairo, where they found all the documents that exposed the brutality and horror of the regime. And I think that's partly, that whole opening up of Egyptian society that's come about because of that revolution is partly, I think, what gives us extra space for Mamdouh to be able to pursue the, Egyptian government and people like Omar Suleiman with such vigour. But I think that we should feel some personal inspirations. It's not just battles in Egypt that are important, it's battles here. And we want to try and build in whatever struggles that do exist in Australia, whether it's a refugee campaign, the campaign for same-sex marriage rights, or the campaign to support unions against the regressive laws that Barry O'Farrell has just introduced. These are all vitally important points of resistance where we can stand up and say we're not going to take it, we're not going to let our rights be trampled upon or taken away from us. And they build for the future, because I think that one of the things as we see wave after wave of struggle unfolding around the world, whether it's the Middle East or the demonstrations in the squares in Madrid and Barcelona and Athens and Thessaloniki in Greece, we know that people will resist when push comes to shove. When the system starts to bear down on people as it is in the economic crisis, people will fight back, and we want to be part of those battles. But we need to prepare some kind of organisation, some kind of apparatus and politics that means when those battles come that we're going to be able to make the most of them. And that means throwing ourselves into the battles of today and building a socialist organisation that puts capitalism and its horrors at the heart of our critique of what's wrong with the world, but also looks to the enormous power of workers to liberate everyone from those horrors. And I think keeping those two things in mind and building an organisation around them is what we're trying to do in Socialist Alternative today, because we want to make sure that the battles we're starting to see unfold, which I think are the beginnings of a new stirring of hopefully what could be world revolution, that when those battles start to crash on our shores, that we're ready. So I encourage you, if you've been moved by what Mamdouh says tonight, if you want to get involved, if you've been thinking about committing yourself to a fight, not just about refugees or not just against anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism, and not just against wars, but against the whole system that lives and breathes on the kind of vile poison that we've discussed so much tonight, well then I really think you want to get involved in Socialist Alternative. And I'll leave it there.